we've heard a lot. Much of it has been provocative. I think we could let the panelists question each other for some good amount of time and have a robust conversation. But I'd like to see, thank you, Bernie, if we have some questions, and it looks like we do. And they look to be lengthy and deliberative questions. So let's see. They're in the folder outside. Not exactly, but what was provided to us, but additional information. Thank you. Okay, so here's a practical question. What does support look like for teachers that want to or are required to teach more inclusive curriculum, especially in communities where there may be opposition to some of that content, or indeed to the very notion of inclusive curriculum? And I would say with all these questions, let's have one or two people who most want to respond rather than necessarily go down the line. Would anybody like to take that one? I'm kind of pointing myself at Jessica, but.
I mean, I think I kind of already said this, so I won't belabor it so we can get to more questions. But I do think that support means it's lasts a long time and it's not a one-shot deal. I also think that the voice of teachers in developing that support is really important. And to the extent that we're creating professional learning structures that aren't responsive to what teachers are asking for is pretty problematic. And I think that what we've learned, I'm glad you brought up critical pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, ethnic studies, all of these kind of fields where folks have for a long time been thinking about how do we do this in schools. One of the biggest learnings has been that teachers have to do this self-examination, the reflection, the kind of critical analysis of who they are and what they bring to the classroom. And I think any approach to support that doesn't include asking teachers to do that work is going to lack something. But the other part of it is that administrators, district leaders, policymakers have to build space where we provide some room for people to learn and grow. We create evaluation metrics that don't value this, and so we don't support teachers in that way. We don't hire teachers thinking about their ability to deliver on these things, to create the kind of classroom communities that we imagine, and then we don't get them in the classroom. So all of the rubrics, the things that we create that are thinking about the teachers we hire, how we evaluate them, how we support them, need to include the teachers as part of the construction of those, and the values that we say we have to be embedded within them. So that's what I would argue.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to address that? So here's a question that I don't think will take a long answer, but I think it's really worth mentioning in the context of what many of our panelists talked about. So in living out the promise of action civics yourselves, panel members, and consistent with the theories highlighted by several of you, have you ever made your participation in a panel on civic education contingent on youth representation or participation in the conversation? Just, I don't know if anybody wants to answer, but really a provocative thing to mention. Given what we're talking about.
I'm happy to. I don't know that I've opted out of a panel invitation. I've certainly had conversations with organizers and about that issue. And I actually thought about it on the way here today. Actually, last night I thought about it as well for this particular panel. But we will. I mean, at the Center for Educational Equity, I don't take personal. I don't take personal credit for this, but the Center for Educational Equity, for example, back in last spring, we had a convening at Teachers College, and we made sure that on every single panel, I think it was a full day conference, on every single panel we had at least one or two students, along with professors of education, along with teachers, along with district administrators, and it made for a much richer conversation for all the reasons I mentioned and several people mentioned in their comments on youth participation. But I think, thanks for the question and then for pointing out that, today we're not quite living up to that ideal for those of us who share it.
I would just add, sorry,
Yeah,
Peter.
no, go ahead, Robert, and then Peter.
I've been a little bit vocal in terms of criticizing what I call civics theater sometimes. So it's a great question, and thank you for the check. But my caution is, and it's a good impulse, but putting on my teacher hat, do it for the right reasons. What's the educational value to the kid or are we doing it just so we can say that we're practicing what we preach? We know the difference when we see it, but let's just make sure we're doing it for the right reasons.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so I honestly, the answer is no, I haven't done that. Though I have been trying to get youth voice into meetings. But this is a moment to sort of say why actually in a core way I think I do agree with Joe, but I didn't quite say it in a way that conveyed why the core. So as I understand your work in New York and other places, you have a real political strategy which goes all the way from a grassroots mobilization to a potentially a court case. And so, or
Not in New
legislate-
York.
or
Yeah.
well, anyway,
Yeah.
that's the way. That's the model you guys have. So in that kind of model, you need community people, right? You actually need them to be effective politically, and they have a reason to be there, which is that they're part of something that's moving. So it's not just your discretionary choice whether to have a diverse and representative bodies there. So that's how politics, in the broadest way, should work. A lot of the stuff that I've been involved in, I'm not embarrassed about. I think it's been actually really hard to do and valuable in its own way, but it's a different kind of thing. It's much more the mobilization of different kinds of expertise to talk to different kinds of stakeholders. And so when you do that, you can be attentive to different dimensions of diversity, and maybe a step we should make is, have the panel have a youth always on it. But I think it's really limited, because all you're really doing is, I mean, to Robert's point, you may be just conducting some kind of theater. At the best case, you're using your power to make one little spot for somebody. You're not actually accountable to that person because you don't need them in a certain way. So what we need is the kind of political strategy you guys are building. I just think that's the nub of it. It's sort of, how do you have an actual political strategy that's based on some constituency that actually wants something and is calling on you to deliver it.
Yeah.
And then all the questions of diversity and inclusion arise again, but they arise in a much different, and almost like it's a key shift. You're having a different music is now playing. So now the diversity and inclusion, actually it can be equally contentious, because now the seat really matters. Now you need to be there. So now the question is, the question I'm sure you guys would confront would be like, are working class white people from upstate New York represented or not? And so you're accountable to an answer to that question. That's very different from designing a panel for some people in D.C. And I don't mean to diminish that, or for example, our participation in this event today. This is actually also valuable and actually harder than it looks. You have to come up with the resources. You have to get people to come. They can be done well or badly, but what I was really trying to do was endorse this political strategy you guys have.
Yeah. And I think, if I may respond to that for just a moment, I don't think we see as much of a political strategy, unless you were thinking long-term political, in that who's going to hold the government accountable for following through on these policies that affect these young people directly, their younger siblings, their nieces and nephews. And also, we believe they do have expertise. There are different kinds of expertise, right, as I think we've noted here on the panel. So, there's academic expertise, which obviously is very valuable. I think all of us on the panel here do some kind of research, and, we publish papers and essays and all that. But young people, and it's not just pick any young person, invite them to the table, throw them up on a panel and say, okay, talk about civic learning. And we need to, that's how we usually do. That's how it works out best with youth participation, is that you have a chance to, some of them know more in some ways than some of the panelists, at least particular facets of this issue, but often you have pre-conversations to make sure whether you're talking about policy or legal issues. Well, some of them are not lawyers or policymakers, but they get, if you explain some of the policy structures and processes, they get it pretty quickly, and they add their own expertise based on their experiences, based on their understanding of what's happening in the world, based on their knowledge, deep knowledge of their schools, and what works well for young people directly. So.
Yeah. Last word on this one.
Nope, I can't. I want to add to this too, and I think what is remarkable about the work that you're doing, Joe, that you all are doing, is that it's not even just an invitation one time. It is a structure for consistent, continued development themselves and engagement and having actual voice and a seat at the table and decision-making power. And I think, in Chicago, we had to make that move away from the honorary student board member, which a lot of school districts have, and we still have in Chicago, to a now student advisory committee that meets regularly with the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, and actually departments have to go to those meetings and present ideas to get student feedback. And then we have local student voice committees in schools that meet regularly that bring forward policy changes to their administrators and work on them. And then the students organize an annual conference that they lead and run for students from across the district. And in this year's one, anyone in the district who's trying to push policies forward, they have to go and lead focus groups in the space of the students to get feedback on these policies and be able to share this is what young people think about it. And I think that's the kind of transition we also have to make, is that we also need to go to other spaces, not just for the student voice question. If our spaces are not representative, if the meetings we keep going to are not representative, we also have to make efforts to go to the communities that we're saying we want to connect with and learn from and see the work that they're doing versus we're just going to invite one more person to the table. We need to build those bridges and make our work relevant to the issues and concerns that young people, folks who've been marginalized in a lot of ways, also have access to the kind of conversations that we're having.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about the role of higher education and how do members of the panel envision higher education contributing to the work of K-12 systems and teachers, particularly around these questions.
Maybe Peter wants to start on that.
You've been voluntold.
I guess so. There's no special reason I should, because I'm not really involved with teacher education, and it so happens Tufts, doesn't have an ed school. There's certainly a vibrant discussion about civic education in higher education, and for college students, and that's an important topic as well, and has a slightly different set of theories of change, partly because there's not much regulatory. There aren't things like standards, and on the other hand, there's a powerful market competitive problems in higher ed. I think that. One important point is that you can't expect higher ed to be the main way that you strengthen democracy, because really a minority of kids are getting the full 4-year college experience. So the way I really want to answer the question is by saying the ways that teacher education can support K-12 civics, but I don't really have a special expertise on that.
Leo?
Yeah, so I think, it is generally the case that we need teacher preparation, which prepares teachers to be able to teach in a way that actively engages their students in the subject matter. That doesn't fall back on modes of lecturing and other sorts of didactic presentations. But it is such an obvious need in civics. I mean, if there was ever a subject that would be so contradictory to be teaching students about what it means to be a citizen, and for that to be a process in which they were supposed to silently sit in their seats and ingest learning. So I think, what we generally say about schools of education, we need to say doubly and triply here.
I'll just chime in briefly. I wrote an open letter within the last couple of months to my School of Education. I'm certified in New York State to teach K-6 Common Branch education, and the open letter was decrying the fact that nothing in my 2 years master program prepared me to actually teach children how to read. So this is not to be dour. But the level of preparation that we get to be successful in our classroom is so inadequate. Yes, to everything Leo's saying, but at the risk of being dour, get in line. There's a lot of things that need to get fixed about preparing teachers to be successful.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to try to ask this next question, but if I get it wrong, Rob, I'm going to call on you because your handwriting is bad, and I know this is from you. You're clearly really bad. So the Rural School and Community Trust has conducted comprehensive research looking at the deleterious impact on civic education and participation when rural high-need schools and districts, which are often poor schools, are consolidated or worse, closed. problems of distance, access just to get to them. Distance learning isn't a singular solution in terms of equity, and the question is to get some thoughts regarding other options related to equity for rural students and families.
Marla, you are my translator.
That was rough.
My handwriting's terrible. But just for clarification, we have research that shows that in rural communities, you close schools, you consolidate districts, you put kids on buses, civic participation, real,
Disintegrates.
authentic participation, just evaporates. So your thoughts in that regard, I'd appreciate. And we saw
Thank you.
in the exit polling in the 2016 election of this state.
Okay,
So it reminds me, thanks for the question. It reminds me of a 2011-2012 study that we at the Center for Educational Equity conducted, which we visited large urban districts, suburban districts, small city districts, and a number of rural schools as well, particularly in upstate New York. And one of the things that principals and teachers in particular told us is there are many young people who lack transportation in a way that would allow them to participate in after school. For those schools that are able to provide extracurricular after school opportunities, young people were barred from doing so because they had to catch the first bus as soon as the bell rang. And, those who, the few parents who had vehicles or were able to commute an hour or so, from their remote area, they were able to participate. But it was a real issue, particularly for lower income rural students. And I think that's true. We find that's true just drawing a connection to what we found in our recent pilot study on access to civic learning related resources in a few schools in New York City and in the nearby suburbs. We found that there were young people who, there's one school in which the principal said 50% of their young people work sort of fast food type jobs after school. And the school was struggling to provide, whether it's school newspaper, debate, a lot of things we associate with developing civic skills. But those young people who had to help their families pay bills, who didn't receive an allowance from their families to pay for a cell phone or to buy sneakers or, clothes or whatever it is they needed, they were also barred. Right? They weren't able to participate in after-school activities. So I think there's some interesting parallels and intersections, particularly among folks living in poverty in general, both in rural contexts and large urban contexts that we haven't fully explored. There's a lot of potential there for both research, but then also advocacy.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
So that's great. A couple of things to build on. One is my colleagues at Tufts at this thing called Circle Research Center coined the term last year, civic deserts, which were places where young people reported, so it's subjective, but they reported that there were just no places or opportunities, no places or organizations where they could go to do anything civic, where they could have a discussion of an issue or be involved with community change. And if you're in a civic desert, it correlated with very bad voter turnout and with other bad outcomes. But the really strongest, the most civic deserts are rural. And so that's not really the problem for the urban kid who is more likely to report that, there are things you could do. There may be barriers to them doing it, but they don't feel that they're in a civic desert in the same way. So that's just one quick thought. But the other is we've gone through a big process of 30 or 40 years at least, maybe more, of both consolidating schools and also standardizing education in different kinds of ways through standardized testing and so on. And one of those things may or may not be good for the educational outcomes, I don't know. It's not what I study. But they've had an effect on the degree to which adults and kids and parents and teachers are actually kind of governing education itself, because the decisions are being made by smaller numbers of people further away. And so Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize, first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics and died a few years ago, she calculated, she didn't get the Nobel Prize for this, it was a sideline for her, but she calculated that about a quarter as many people today, Americans, are involved in kind of public governance as was the case 50 years ago. So, for example, school boards, because we've consolidated them. So the population's grown and the number of school districts has fallen. And so you could argue that the most important civic education schools do is they are a place that then the community governs through things like school board membership. So if you wipe out half the school boards in America because you consolidated, you just wiped out a lot of civic education. And we need to at least count that in the balance as we think about education reform.
Thank you. Anyone else on this? I have one or two more. I've got a comment, a question, and then I'm going to do a lightning round to end us with the wisdom of our panelists. So even though this is really not a question, I'm reading it because I agree with it. It's called privilege of the moderator. Civics education needs to first center on understanding of what is the United States physically. It astounds me how many seemingly well-educated people who occupy high public posts do not know that the U.S. territories are not foreign countries, such as the Florida congressman who contemptuously referred to Puerto Rico as a country during his appearance yesterday on C-SPAN. Yeah, it's pretty annoying. This is. Oh, do, yes.
I'm used to making myself unpopular, as you probably can tell, on panels. Usually on civic ed panels, I make myself unpopular by being the only person in the room who likes this Joe Foss Institute thing where every high school kid should pass the American citizenship test. Because my laugh line is always, okay, you're right, it shouldn't be a high school graduation requirement. It should be an elementary school requirement, okay? But I mean, we really do need to rebuild the common knowledge base of our students, if for no other reason, not to avoid saying stupid things on C-SPAN or CNN, although that too. But yeah, I mean, if you don't advance from a common body of knowledge, we're just not having the same conversation. So this is low-hanging fruit. Get it done, come on.
Can I make a caveat
Yes.
to that, or a push to that, which is that, again, thinking about what is the civic knowledge that's important is not a neutral idea. It's not a neutral topic, and so we do need to talk about that. And also how these things are framed. If you are not allowing for, the opportunity for critical questioning and inquiry into these, you run the risk of alienating young people whose lives don't live up to the things that we say are there. So that sometimes these things get lumped in as common truths, and they're not. And so I think to the extent that we could, and that would be, the hardest thing would be to get a bunch of social studies people in a room and get them to agree on what everyone needs to know. That would just, as after many departments that I've been a part of, that's a hard thing to get. So, but I just don't, it's not so simple as to say, let's just return to this body of knowledge, because that is a political question in itself.
There are 50 states. Anybody think that kids should not know that? Anybody? There are 3 branches of government. Anybody opposed to that? Yeah. I'm talking
So-
about the baby simple base levels.
But I
That's
think an important question here is what leads students to actually retain knowledge that you give them. And so, federalism is any social studies will teach you that federalism will tell you that federalism is the driest topic in the world to try to teach. And that if students retain like 5% of it a week later, you've been successful. But if a student is engaged in a learning project in which they're trying to figure out how to improve voting, the rate of voting in their community, and they actually have to figure out what the different levels of government are able to do vis-a-vis that project, they will have learned federalism in a way that they will retain. And so the key question here is not just in the abstract, what's the body of knowledge that we would like everyone to have, but how do we engage students in an educational process where they actually retain and use the knowledge? And it's just like your multiplication tables. You can memorize multiplication tables, but if you don't use them, you will have forgotten them in 3 weeks. And so I testified that because the nuns ran me through multiplication tables once a week.
3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
And by the time we hit the 12s, I didn't remember the 3s. And it was only when I actually started doing multiplication problems that I remembered my multiplication facts. And the same is true of any body of knowledge.
So I actually think that in this last round, the panel has kind of been addressing this last question, but I'm going to give you a shot at it anyway if you want to add more to it. How do we have common ground in civics if we don't have a common national understanding of our common national history. Again, citing the example of the Civil War and slavery.
So I don't think, I think our understanding of our history is a project. It's ongoing. The idea that there's some sort of conception of our history that's done, and you know, we need to understand that, and misunderstands the nature of historical knowledge and how we relate to it. And so, you know, what I would say to Robert's point about patriotism is that what's important for me is that students know what about the United States is worthy of their love and what isn't. So the idea that one should just love one's country is, to me, very insufficient. But if the question is what one loves about one's country is the ability to correct its flaws, if what one loves about one country is the fact that a country that's born in radical exclusivity of many of its members has found ways to include them more and more and continues in that project, that to me is what I would want my students to come away with. And so in the course of that, their understanding of the history of their country is going to change, because the understanding of the history of the country at large is changing. And you know, we now pay attention to things that we didn't pay attention to in 1968 when I was sitting in a civics classroom. I've just dated myself.
Marla, do you mind just repeating? There was a particular word in the question that I've now lost, but it was important.
Okay, now I'm going to find the question again. Okay, how do we have common ground in civics if we don't have a common national understanding of our
Okay.
common national history?
Right. Okay. Let's parse the word understanding, because I think that's where this question rotates. Sometimes I fear, and I don't want to impugn the questioner, when we say common understanding, we mean common interpretation, right? And that's where the conflict happens. I am an unrepentant disciple of E.D. Hirsch Jr. I've never had an idea in education that he didn't have first and better. And by the way, thank you historically to the AFT for being stalwart in defense of his work for 20 years now, back to Al Shanker for core knowledge. The reason I'm stalwart in my support for the Hirschian ideal, as it were, is because it proceeds from this assumption that we can't have these conversations unless we're looking at the same thing. Now then we can turn it around and talk about the angles and whatnot. But unless we have a common set of mental furniture, as it were, it's a meaningless discussion. So this is why I keep nattering on in panels like this about the need to at least begin with. And Leo, I take I don't disagree with anything you say. And I hope you haven't interpreted what I said as a blind patriotism. It's an informed patriotism. But if we don't proceed from the idea that, hey, we have something here that is worth improving or perfecting, then we're wasting our time. And why would we expect students, our children, to be invested at all in it unless they see some value in it?
So I think what might be useful is to think of this more as a common conversation than a common understanding. So that this is an ongoing conversation that we have, that we need to be having with each other. In political philosophy, there are those who think it's possible to achieve, some uninfluenced by bad interests, perfect common meeting of minds. And I think that is not a very helpful approach. That one has to have more of an approach that understands that conflict and differences of opinion are of necessity something that's happening here. But what we need to have is a conversation that everybody's part of. And what we need to have is the ability to interrogate the received truths that we have. so that we hopefully can arrive at a better understanding.
And I would add a conversation that we can participate equally and fairly from a position of equal strength in terms of our knowledge base.
Thank you. I'm going to give Peter the last word on this question, then we'll go to wrap up.
I just think it's worth thinking about the difference between the sort of factual part and the value judgment part. It's worth thinking about the difference between the fact part and the value part. And I think Jesse was saying something similar in response to the question about Puerto Rico. So I think it's a fact that slavery was a driving force of the Civil War. I think it's a terrible thing that only 3% of kids know that. Those are two different points. One of the problems we have is just that the amount of stuff that you could learn is infinite. And so there are value judgments involved in what's important. So built into my dismay that kids don't know that is a much bigger philosophical view of the American story, in which slavery is a key. It becomes key. So I'm actually much less concerned that they don't know the three branches of government than that they don't know that. But that's a value question. So I mean, I think you can't pull the facts free from the values. I also kind of wonder why kids don't know that, because they certainly spend a lot of time studying the Civil War in every single history class in America. So one theory, I don't really know why they don't know that, but one theory is actually motivated reasoning. That is, it's an uncomfortable fact for a lot of kids, and so it's not, the contrary evidence is not heard. If that's the case, then it just reinforces the way that sort of values in politics are woven right through anything we might think of as facts.
Can I pick up for a moment on, and I don't know if you meant this example earnestly or you just threw it out, that you don't care if kids know the three branches
Somewhat
of
less.
government? Okay.
No, I do care, but somewhat less.
Okay.
I mean, if you tell me that 55% of kids know the three branches of government and 3% know that slavery caused the Civil War, I'm much more upset about the latter.
Fair enough. But I mean, I find myself taken aback by the idea that, well, who cares if not that you said that, but it doesn't matter that if kids don't know the three branches of government. Those of us in civic education who valorize action civics, student agency, well, federalism, if you don't know where the lever is, you're dependent upon somebody else to say, there's the lever, go pull it. You have no agency. So I mean, it's integral to student agency that they know these things.
But I think a poor approach to action civics wouldn't have included learning that in the first place, right? So part of, and action civics is one of, YPAR, I think also, like these opportunities, the investigation itself asks you, who has power? Who is the decision maker? How does this work? What historically has happened? Who are the voices? That's part of it. And I think that the question around retention and how do young people actually hold on to this and then make use of it later when they're not with any of us anymore and they're out, and even today, is about the best and the most effective way to get them to hold that on and to use it. It is not useful to memorize 100 questions that then you cannot apply in any other situation and you could easily go to the internet to find the answer to. It is much more useful to understand if I'm going to advocate for a local elected official or talk about the presidential elections, I should not question if President Trump has anything to do with the Chicago Transit Authority and if my bus runs on time. I need to understand who is doing what, and I learned that through the engagement. So,
And,
Joe,
and
truly
it's-
last word on this,
Yeah.
since we need to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leo.
Everyone else chimed in. I just said, let me think of something to say, just so I can join the crowd. No, but I was thinking about, it's a great question. I'm not so sure. I think it's important to strive for a common conversation. I don't know how practical that is in certain circumstances on certain topics. And I mentioned this in the essay. There are certain notions, was the country better before the Civil War? Right? I mean, we could have a conversation about that. I think some people, you could probably find people who believe one thing, some people believe another. I'm not interested in, that's a very specific example, but I think the idealist in me believes that we need to at least strive to have those common conversations. The question was about history, but I'm also thinking about the future and values. Where do we see ourselves ending up? What is the purpose of retooling, reforming, improving civics education? Referring back to my initial contributions to this conversation, I think we have a different language. Our language depends on whether we see civic language, civic learning language, whether we see civic learning as a path to justice to social transformation, or whether we see it as just sort of greater participation, more conversations, but with no specific direction or desired outcome or vision for, not just for civic learning, but for our democracy. And so I think those two questions, the question that someone posed about history and a common understanding of history, this common understanding that I think is probably impossible around civic learning, civic aspirations, and where we need to go as a country, complicates matters. But again, we need to strive.
I think, if Marla will let me.
Oh, make it quick, Leo.
The
only 'cause it's your organization.
The value of the conversation framework is, one, it lets us ask, are all the voices here? The importance of having all the voices. Two, it lets us ask, are we listening to each other? Are we hearing what each other says? And three, embedded in it is the idea that there's a variety of perspectives, and that these questions that we're looking at in American history, we need to understand that Eugene Debs and Freud Frick are not going to look at the same event and understand it in the same way.
Well, I like to end us on something kind of quick and concrete. So we're going to do this lightning round, and whoever is motivated to speak about it can. So I want to know one thing. Joe, you mentioned earlier that you feel like you're going around to the same, Civic Education Roadshow. One thing that each of you personally wants to do or see happen to advance common ground in civic education, whether it's inside the club or in the broader environment. But one step, one thing each of you want to either take or see happen out of all that we've talked about.
I think we need to take the road show on the road and get it out of the sort of elite convenings. We've been having conversations about how to improve civic education, and I think we need more public engagement with those who are directly affected. I think, I don't know if it was Jesse or someone else who said, we need to go to, if people aren't coming to you to participate, maybe they don't even know you're having the conversation, first of all, you didn't invite them. You need to go to where the people are. So I think public forums, in the true spirit of democracy, going out to towns and communities and cities and holding forums in which, folks with diverse perspectives wrestle with at the state level, for state standards, state curricula. How do we assess civic learning? What should be the best practices? And some people would say that, these people aren't trained, they're not properly equipped to do that work. I think some of the work that we've done, some of the contributions I've seen from so-called ordinary folks, profound contributions and insights and questions, lead me to believe that would be very successful, not only in terms of enriching the conversation, but ultimately in ensuring that these, whatever is produced is implemented with fidelity and is sustained, right? It's done with, it's not just done for, and you have a constituency, you have a coalition, a movement of folks who are supported because they've been at the table and been in the conversation.
Great. So public forums.
Yeah.
Robert.
I don't want to get too granular. Yes, but I don't want to get that granular. Since I can only do one thing and it's all I know how to do, it's kind of evangelize for these things. I'm very fond of joking that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having once uttered the phrase college and career readiness. There's evangelical work to do in terms of restoring the idea that we have these things called public schools to be in the citizen-making business. The first and most important relationship a kid has with a civic institution in this country is with the school. And you could make the case that as that relationship goes, so go all the others. In other words, the more successful, and not just in terms of attainment, I've become fascinated, and I'm a curriculum guy, but I've become very fascinated, almost obsessed in recent years with school culture, meaning the degree to which we successfully signal in ways, in so many ways, to children, you matter, I see you, you belong here, we're invested in you. And this, frankly, transcends questions of race and class. I think it's even more powerful when that investment comes from somebody who does not look like you. So I'm really interested in what we can do to create the conditions that get us back to that first purpose of I don't want to say acculturation, that's the wrong word, but attachment, of making young people realize there's something here for me and I'm bought in.
All right, thank you. You guys are doing great on the one thing, less great on the quick. Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, they're both hard. One thing and time. I guess for me, leaving a school district and now being the last 5 or 6 months in the university setting, it's like night and day in terms of, I think I want to figure out, and what I'm committed to is how those worlds speak to each other more. There's a lot of scholarship that is important for school districts, and I think there's a lot that scholars don't know about how schools actually work. And to the extent that we could help build those bridges, I care a lot about school context. I think it matters almost more than what's in the curriculum for how we position young people to participate. But I don't think we can get there if civics is outside of a conversation about how schools need to improve overall. And I think that we need to think about school improvement efforts and that engagement with civic education as a part of that larger project. And so to the extent that I can participate in bringing districts into the conversation is something I'm really interested in.
Thank you. Leo.
So I believe we have a robust conception of citizenship education that a number of us here have discussed today. The challenge is that it's not easy for teachers or schools to enact that. And so if I, was master of the universe, my focus would be on what can one do from above that opens up the space for teachers and schools to do this. Certainly, a testing culture, a focus on testing is very problematic for the development of the kind of civics that we're interested. Something that treats civics as something that only happens in one classroom and not as part of entire school culture as part of it. But I really think it's key for us to try to figure out how we create the space for schools and teachers who really want to do this to be able to do it.
Thanks, Leah. Peter.
So I'll just build on Joe. So Joe's, remember, concept wasn't just, I think, forums, but it's sort of a grassroots movement to change in a particular place, such as a state. And so I would just endorse that, except I would add to it that I'd like to see that happen in quite different parts of our country, just in part as an experiment to see how different it'll look, and in part because I think that's a way to go to scale. So I'm not sure that people in Oklahoma will borrow the New York model that you guys built. So, but I'd like to serve the kids in Oklahoma, so I'd like to see them do it there too. So 5 or 6 really robust efforts that do take on content as well as policy and that are bottom up.
Thank you.
Funders in the room?
This has been a really rich conversation and one that no doubt will continue in many venues and hopefully this one again. Please join me in thanking the panel and thank all of you for being here.